From the heart of Worcester County on Maryland's coast, I'm Commissioner Chip Bertino, and you're plugged into the Conduit Street Podcast, the place to learn about the policies affecting local government in Maryland.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here, and on today's episode, we're digging into something that's getting a lot of attention right now and frankly causing a lot of confusion, and that's what's happening at the federal level around elections, mail ballots, voter verification, and what any of that actually means for Maryland. Because this is hitting from two directions, Maryland voters are hearing a lot of conflicting information and trying to understand what it means for their ability to vote. And at the same time, county governments and local boards of elections are trying to understand whether any of these changes the way that we actually run elections on the ground. And so to help walk through all of that, we are joined by the Maryland State Administrator of Elections, Jared DeMarinis. Jared, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're busy, but there's a lot going on at the federal level, and certainly it's just timely.
Yes. So thanks, Kevin, for having me on the podcast. I always appreciate having a chance to talk through this. And you're correct. There's a lot of information that's getting out there right now. And basically, it's turning into dis and misinformation because people are picking up half-truths and not hearing the full picture or understanding these complex issues here that are going on. So I always love the opportunity, and thanks for having the opportunity to help correct some of the record out there.
Absolutely. But right off the bat, Jared, recently there was an executive order issued by the president, and I want to give you a chance to address part of what was in that order right up front here, because I think it's concerning, and I really haven't seen much in terms of media coverage. And I think this is kind of a big piece of this executive order. We'll get into the rest of it later, but off the bat here, Jared, let me give you a chance to address that executive order and maybe the most disturbing piece of it, and I probably in your mind, but certainly in mine.
Yes, thank you. Basically, one part of that executive order was to threaten prosecution against election officials across the United States for just doing their job if we don't abide by this executive order. It's going to have a chilling effect on the ability to administer elections. It won't have an ability to chill me or intimidate me. I found it to be something that of a bullying tactic to force compliance, but it is disturbing that the executive order threatened with directing the DOJ to prosecute election officials for just doing their jobs, and that is just unfathomable and unconscionable in my mind.
Right, certainly concerning, and obviously I agree, unconscionable to threaten state and local election folks for doing their jobs, carrying out the law and making sure people can vote. So that in itself is super concerning, Jared. But we have other things going on. We've got the SAVE Act, we've got a Supreme Court case on mail ballots, and then, of course, you've got this recent executive order. And I think both voters and local governments are asking the same question: what matters here and what does not? We know that counties, through their local boards of elections, run elections on the ground, and very much in partnership with the Maryland State Board of Elections, kind of sets the law at the statewide level. But Jared, there's so much going on. There's so many pending issues and questions. How can we reassure voters, and can you reassure the public, counties, voters, of where we are right now, what's pending, and what we need to prepare for potentially as we approach election season?
Yes. I've said this in multiple statements right here, right now. One, the United States Constitution is clear. The authority to administer election predominantly resides with the states. So Maryland elections are run by Maryland laws. And that, to me, is important here, so that as we go through it, yes, there are some federal laws, not executive orders, federal laws passed by Congress and signed by the president that, impact how we do our elections. But basically, the Constitution is again clear. Maryland law governs how elections are administered and run in the state of Maryland, and all the authority remains with the state.
And so that's really important to get across, I think, because right now there's a lot out there suggesting that elections could change quickly or dramatically. And of course, then you're concerned with mis and disinformation, especially when you have sort of the groundwork being laid here by all this activity at the federal level, I think it could be easier for people to trick others, and maybe they'll start to buy into some of these rumors. And so I really want to make clear, what is happening, and that things won't change very quickly or dramatically. And if they do change at all, there'll be sufficient communication between the state and the voters, right? And that's obviously with the counties acting as a conduit through the local boards. But what do you say to people who are right now spreading information that, we're going to have to change things very quickly and it's going to look dramatically different here in Maryland?
So that's why we have an aggressive outreach and voter education program right now. I'm making sure that we're trying to correct the record and disseminate as much information as possible. And one of the bigger things right now that for your listeners is we've just released an app as well. So please download the Go Vote Maryland app to get all your information right there about times, locations, Dropbox locations, about mail-in voting. There's frequently asked questions there so that you get up-to-date, correct information. Additionally, there's a lot of information about whether there's nationalization of elections and that federal agencies might try to change voting procedures or take over election administration. Again, the Constitution is clear. All that authority rests with the state, and even during states of emergency, if they're so declared, between now and November, the authority rests with the governor and the State Board of Elections under Maryland law for any emergencies that would take place. As for other aspects, we are monitoring every piece of information out there and making sure that we kind of sift through it and get the correct information to the voters.
Right. And I know it's a lot to sift through, and I know that you all are in overdrive over there, and it's quite an extenuating circumstance to have the federal government potentially, acting against, like you said earlier, state and local election officials. This is supposed to be a partnership, but now we are in these trying times, and there's a lot of concern. So so just to reiterate that, federal agencies do not have the authority to come into Maryland and close polling places, change time, change procedures, or take over, your administration of the state's elections.
That is 100% clear. Yes, there was talk from a former Department of Homeland Security secretary about FEMA's role possibly in elections. They have no role whatsoever in elections, and they cannot mandate any changes. Only the governor can do that. So FEMA cannot close polling places, alter election day, change the manner or how we vote. So yes. Again, state law is very, very clear on the matter.
All right, let's get into the SAVE Act, Jared, because this is getting a lot of attention in Congress. The National Association of Counties flagged concerns about using a federal database for citizenship verification that wasn't designed for voter registration. I know there are a lot of other pieces in the bill. From your perspective, what does this look like both for voters and the people running elections if the SAVE Act were to actually pass Congress, which would be weird because Congress, they don't really pass bills anymore, but this is getting a lot of attention at the federal level.
So, Kevin, the interesting part about the SAVE Act is that there's a program that they're trying to use, which is called the SAVE program, which is about the citizenship part. And just to let you know, what that SAVE meant to verify the citizenship portion of it is called the Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements. That's the program through the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. That's the database that they use. This is not designed for voter registration or list maintenance purposes. It is designed for alien verification for alien verification for entitlement programs. It does not meet the requirements necessary for list maintenance, and it produces erroneous information regarding registered voters' citizenship. In fact, using the SAVE database there could disenfranchise qualified voters. And this has always been contrary to the intent of Maryland law, which is encouraging the maximum number of eligible individuals that they can register rather than disenfranchising eligible individuals with unnecessary burdens to exercise their constitutional right to vote. So, this is something that it is not designed for it, and the implications of disenfranchising, I would say, possibly tens of thousands of individuals could impact their constitutional right. This is, and I always want to get back to what we're talking about here, that the right to vote is a sacred right. And this is one of the things that I love about my job, is that, I help administer and allow people to exercise a constitutional right. Not many jobs allow you to do that. Mine does. And you've seen me, right? I've done exhibits in the General Assembly. I love the history of it. And this is something that people have worked really hard, from white male property owners to, everyone over the age of 18 has the ability to vote. And we've always tried to expand that franchise. And this would be, this is not something where when we make a mistake, that we put someone off the rolls. You're silencing that person's voice, and you're silencing everyone who fought very hard to make sure that person had that voice, to be able to have their voice counted in the upcoming election. This is, like I've said, not like some supermarket, rewards program here where they go, oh, we made a mistake. Sorry, sir. We'll give you, this many extra points here. It doesn't work like that. It's important that that's where, we want to make sure that everything we do is correct and we're not disenfranchising quality voters.
And Jared, even if you were to use the SAVE database in Maryland, we don't remove voters based on third-party data alone, right? That database or any other database that comes from a third party, and quite frankly, this is third-party data that they're talking about. Talk about what we do here in Maryland and why this just does not jive with the way that we do things. And we want, again, with the intent of making sure that everyone who is able to vote has the right to vote, and expanding the franchise.
So, right. Basically, at the end here, when a person, they attest to their citizenship, and, we then verify their identity through MVA or the Social Security Administration. And, this is a part of state and federal laws. Once they meet all the qualifications, which is 18, not currently incarcerated, then a U.S. citizen, they're eligible to vote. And we have, made sure that we've had AVR, which is automatic voter registration agencies. We've done online, registration purposes through our database so that people can enter in that information in a safe and secure manner here. We've worked with other outside groups for voter registration drives. So, we make sure that, how people get on the rolls is in accordance with law. And then the maintenance portion of it is basically making sure that we follow, the correct list maintenance procedures as defined by NVRA, which is, the old motor voter law, as well as, the state rules as well. So when we get information from the courts about, a person being incarcerated, then, they're no longer eligible. We get information from the Department of Health about individuals that have died, so that we can do this list maintenance. We are a part of a compact with ERIC, which is the Electronic Registration Information Center, which is basically multiple states coming together and sharing voter registration lists so that we help clean up our rolls to see about duplicate voters in other states. And that is a very successful program here. Where I'm happy to kind of announce that Virginia, which was not in the ERIC system, is now going to be joining later on, hopefully this year. So, that will be a major boost for us as well.
And Jared, in addition to potentially disenfranchising voters, this does matter on the administration side, on the county side. on the local board of election side, because local boards are the ones doing a lot of this verification work. And if you introduce a system that produces incomplete or inconsistent data, that translates into things like more review, more staff time, more costs at the local level. And I also want to make this point clear, and I know you'll agree, there is no widespread voter fraud in Maryland. That is 100% the truth. And so a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, I don't want people to think that there are these widespread issues that need fixing, because there aren't. And that's been proven time and time again.
That is very true. Exactly. Yes. And any new requirements, you're correct, would fall on the local election administration and officials to implement and, impact, real operational costs as well. So, yes.
Okay, so we have the SAVE Act that, that is, being debated right now in Congress. Let's shift to mail ballots, because there are two things happening here. There's a Supreme Court case that could affect deadlines, and then there's the executive order we talked about earlier, and that also talks about United States Postal Service involvement and restrictions on ballot delivery. What should voters and counties understand about both of those issues? First, let's talk about maybe the pending SCOTUS case.
So the SCOTUS case right now is about when mail-in ballots are to be received and counted. This would affect just the general election, not the primary election currently, and it would impact the federal offices. Right now, the General Assembly is taking up bills about, making sure that it would, that the state offices are still to be counted. State and county offices are still to be counted. So right now we're monitoring the case itself and its impact on federal offices, and also upcoming legislation through the General Assembly that will just, I guess, make sure or reaffirm the position of Maryland to count state and county offices on the upcoming ballot. Now, as for the executive order, it talked about USPS involvement and not delivering mail unless individuals were on a pre-cleared list. It was, let's just be clear about this. The president, can't, impact or direct how the U.S. Postal Service delivers its mail. Additionally, we have other laws in place just to make sure that you cannot attempt to delay or prevent ballot delivery. So, those are in Maryland laws. I think this point here is that if individuals feel that there's issues or they have concerns with the Postal Service and their delivery, we do offer and mitigate that through the Dropbox. And I think that that's probably, we're going to see an uptick in Dropbox usage for voters, and the local boards are going to have to, make sure that they're out there collecting on a daily basis. We monitor those Dropboxes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with video surveillance on top of it, so they're very safe and secure. And the local election directors and their staff go out and, collect from them on a daily basis. So, for voters, I strongly recommend the use of a Dropbox.
Right. And right now, Jared, so what we're talking about here, under current Maryland law, local boards count mail ballots. They're postmarked by election day and received within the allowed time frame. But I think Maryland is one of 20 states, maybe, including states like Mississippi. So this is not, Maryland. A lot of people view Maryland as a liberal state, a blue state. But we're not just talking about blue states. I just said Mississippi, and I think it is 20 states total, Jared, that allow that count ballots as long as they're postmarked on election day. So this would be a big change, not just in Maryland, but in several other states. And certainly any changes to those deadlines would force local boards to adjust how and when they review, count, certify ballots. And again, that affects staffing, timelines, workload already during a very busy time. And especially as we are approaching very quickly election day in November, all these things pending just creates more chaos and uncertainty at the local level as well.
Yes. And, that's why, we're, again, aggressive with our voter outreach and education with mail-in voters to make sure if you receive a mail-in ballot to, mail it in at least a week early. If not, use those drop boxes as you get closer to election day.
And Jared, I going back to, to the executive order, you in your statement, which we'll share a link to all these things we're talking about, but you put out a statement, especially around this idea of a federal quote unquote citizenship list. And for voters, of course, that raises concern. But for Maryland, that's not something that's going to change how voter registration works. And I just want to drive that home again. All this talk about citizenship lists and USPS looking at some list and deciding whether or not to deliver a ballot, that is not changing how voter registration in Maryland works, right?
That is correct, right? The official voter registration rolls are in Maryland are maintained by the State Board of Elections, in conjunction with the local boards of election. But, we're not taking the citizenship list from another agency and, that doesn't have any legal authority or clear standards on it, and basically removing or changing any voter status based upon that information. That is not mandated by state or federal law and is contrary to that, which is, I think, trying to just disenfranchise voters.
And so, Jared, for voters listening, the message to me is very clear. They should rely on state and local election officials, trusted sources, not, outside information, misinformation, disinformation. And for counties, the takeaway should also be clear that if anything changes, it's going to show up in staffing, timelines, costs at the local level. But Jared, I guess, part of my concern with all of this is, you're throwing so much at the wall here. People are seeing all these things, and especially in marginalized communities, maybe it's just, what, I'm not even going to bother with it because I hear all these rumors. I don't want to get caught up in something, even though I absolutely have the right to vote. It's just not worth the hassle. And I guess a big concern for me is that, this just becomes exhaustive for people and they hear all these rumors. They don't know what's true and what's not. And I know the State Board of Elections is doing a fantastic job making sure to get information out there, working through their local boards with county partners to provide this information to people. There's legislation pending in the General Assembly right now. MAKO is very supportive of bills that would give you extra authority in cracking down on dis and misinformation, people who purposefully are doing that to try and dissuade people from exercising their rights. So we are, the state are doing, a lot of things, I think, to make sure that people do know what's going on and that people do have the right to vote if they are indeed allowed to vote under law. That's the goal here. But Maryland is doing a lot to try and make sure that all this stuff being thrown against the wall does not create a situation where people just throw in the towel and say, I'm not even going to deal with it.
That is correct. And, yes, I think that's why we're trying to do newer things as well to reach the voters to where they're at, right? Like this idea of the app so that, a person doesn't have to go searching anymore. Download the app. It'll always be on your phone. You have a question, you can, find the information right off the app. If you have mis or disinformation because you're seeing it in your feed from social media, you can take a snapshot and upload it right through the app and report it to us so that then we can respond back to you and you can have the correct information right then and there at your fingertips. So I think, yes, it is a fast-paced, throw everything at the wall type of scenario here, and we're slowly battling back that dis and misinformation, and it takes a collective here because it's we tell you, you have to make sure that you tell it to your community as your trusted source, because that's how you grow, and that's how you have to slowly push back against the spread of this. And at the end here, it's just making sure you come back to the trusted source of information, which is the State Board of Elections. And about the other part too, which we were talking about the counties and their takeaway, basically, right, when there's a lot of, we make sure that the staffing, the timelines, and all the costs, they're on the front lines as well, and making sure that, doing voter outreach, showing up at those events, takes time and effort. And I appreciate all that they do in order to help that. But it's building it slowly and through, individual events and reaching as many voters as possible.
Yeah, doing things like, demoing the new voting equipment, right? Which the state has done. That's really cool. The exhibits in the State House are really cool, and the House and the Senate buildings are really cool. So I think all that stuff is great. Jared, there's a lot of concern about generative AI deep fakes. And again, this goes into the mis and disinformation. A few years ago, even last year, I remember working on a bill with you that probably should have crossed the finish line but didn't. But so much has even changed since then. It's really hard now to tell the difference between real and fake videos, real videos and videos made with AI. It's becoming better and better every day in terms of the ability to trick people. I know that we're working on legislation right now in the General Assembly, but Jared, what is your level of concern with AI, with people's ability to make potential candidates say things that they didn't really say, and it looks so real that people can't tell the difference, or trusted sources, manipulating them to say things like we're going to close the polling places or we're changing the election date. How can we fight back, and how concerned are you right now with what's going on with this new technology?
Well, I'm hopeful for its passage in the General Assembly about the deep fake bill and giving me more tools to help combat this possibilities out there. I am concerned about it because the viral nature of these deep fakes can take hold and take root really fast. We're preparing and making sure, having rapid response training and, doing multiple tabletop exercises on this matter here in order to prepare for any eventuality. But, it is there and it is a concern. The one thing I am hopeful for is that in the future, because more and more people now are seeing AI, seeing its negative impacts, but also are starting to get a discerning eye towards those videos. And, and trying to just like the old Photoshop days and the old, splicing days, right? Like the first time it comes out, oh my God, we can't decipher this. And now you can easily see, well, that's been Photoshopped. So while, 26, the eye is not that, fine tuned yet, but hopefully in the future, we would be able to get it. But we definitely need to make sure that there are some guardrails and protections in place until we get to that level there. But yeah, it is a major concern. And, one of the big things is making sure that we have the ability to help correct the record and, combat those negative videos as quickly as possible.
And I agree 100%. It's a tricky issue. You get into things like the First Amendment, but I do think there's a good framework in place in a bill right now that should cross the finish line, hopefully by sine die this year. So Jared, as we wrap up here, there is, as we said, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fires burning right now at the federal level when it comes to elections and election administration. But just again, what should voters and local governments take away from all of this right now? I want you to be able to hammer home the message, what the state board is doing, where they should go for information, and again, what is this going to look like as we get into primary season and then into election day?
Well, Kevin, I think you kind of summed it up right there. Where should they go for information? Always come to the State Board of Elections. We're the trusted source. Go to your local Board of Elections if you have questions about anything as well. These are your trusted sources, people. They're the ones that are on the ground. They know how to administer elections. They know the law. They know, what is and what is not mis or disinformation or half truths. They're hard workers that are just, making sure that Maryland elections are the best out there in the United States. And, they work tirelessly, especially during an election year. And, we're getting closer and closer to when actual ballots are being mailed out to individual voters. And I think that, it's funny because June 23rd is right around the corner. But actually, for us, May 9th is when voting actually starts. That's when we start, sending out ballots to military and overseas voters. And May 11th is when we send them out to domestic voters on the permanent mail-in ballot list and anybody else who has signed up for a mail-in ballot. So, we're pretty much like 30-something days away, 31 days from, having ballots out, to be able to be voted. So it's right around the corner. But so if you have questions, make sure, to reach out to the state board or the local board and to download that app because it'll give you some basic information and the ability to report dis and misinformation that you have. And, that's what we're trying to do and give voters as many tools as possible.
Well, we're certainly going to link all the information again for that trusted source of the state board, how to get the app. And Jared, I'm quite confident that, look, we got through COVID, our election infrastructure, and we were able to get folks through and get their votes counted even during the pandemic. So I'm quite confident with your leadership and with the local boards, we'll be able to get through any challenges that lie ahead. But certainly these are unprecedented times, and we really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. As always, happy to always be a part of your podcast. It's fantastic. Thank you.
All right, so we'll go ahead and leave it there for today. If you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, the Conduit Street blog. But for Jared DeMarinis, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off. I also want to give a huge shout out to our esteemed producer, Chantel Malcolm Lim. We will talk to you soon. Have a great day.